Hello, everyone. Thank you again for taking the time to be here with us today, as we're delighted to share this body of work with you. My name is Amanda DiDio, and I'm the VP of Partnerships at Optimistic Design, your host and moderator for today's conversation. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm on the traditional land of the Duwamish people, past and present. Optimistic Design collaborated with KnowledgeWorks with support of the Gates Foundation to co-imagine what the future of math in the United States could look like 10 to 20 years from now, to enable all students, particularly where Black, Latino students, and students from low-income communities thrive in their learning environment and beyond. The result are two unique publications that we'll dive into today. I'd like to invite Megan McCarthy, Strategy Officer at the Gates Foundation's K-12 team, to share why the foundation has chosen to support a project like this and why the focus is on math.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everyone. Good to be here today. So I just want to take a step back for a moment. The goal of the Gates Foundation's U.S. education team is that all students, especially Black, Latino, and low-income students, as Amanda just mentioned, graduate high school with the math skills that they need to succeed. And that's succeed in higher ed, workforce, and in life. And the reason that we at the foundation are focused on math is because we believe that math is a critical skill set that students can be building to increase their problem solving and their critical thinking skills. And right now, for too many students, math is not taught in a way that is engaging or that feels relevant to their lives. And so that's something that we're deeply focused on changing. And so why fund a project like this one? To inform our work, we wanted to generate creative ideas that can help push the constraints of the current system and also take into consideration the technology and the innovation that could emerge in the longer term, so over the next 10 to 20 years. And so we were super excited to be working with Optimistic Design and KnowledgeWorks in developing this longer range vision for a math classroom as a way to incite new ideas. And so I'm just really looking forward to thinking how we at the foundation can use these ideas as inspiration in our work, but then also how the broader field can be thinking about this to push their own thinking. So excited to be here today. Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, Megan. So in 20 years, students will be living in a world that may have some resemblance to our current era, but will encounter very different circumstances like environmental changes, pandemics, the impacts of globalization, changing demographics of the United States, and of course, rapid shifts and growth in technology that will continue to impact opportunities in education and the workforce of the future. While it is impossible to predict the exact series of events that will unfold, we can look at existing trends and indicators to help us define a variety of future possible experiences. So given this, what does an ideal future of math look like, and how do we get there? During today's discussion, panelists will share their research insights and thoughts on this question by examining current drivers of change that lead to possible futures and actionable frameworks that can be used today to impact a future where all students have agency and are thriving in math and their lives. We invite you to add questions for our panelists using the Q&A feature in Zoom, as we'll address as many as we can as time allows at the end. At this time, I'd like to introduce our panelists and start our Q&A. From KnowledgeWorks, we have Katie King, Senior Director of Strategic Engagement, and from Optimistic Design, my colleague SL Rao, VP of Design Research and Strategy. Hi, SL and Katie. Katie, you worked on the publication Future Affecting Math Education, Widening the Lens of Change. Can you share more about what's covered in it, who the intended audience is, and the process that you took into getting these insights?
Sure. Thanks, Amanda, and thank you everyone for being here. As you heard, I'm Katie King with KnowledgeWorks, coming to you from the Nisanon land in Northern California. So yes, our publication is Futures Affecting Math Education, Widening the Lens on Change. And the publication is really grounded in 5 drivers of change. And when we talk about drivers, we are combining trends, emerging issues across all sorts of domains: technology, society and culture, politics and governance, the environment and the economy. And so we looked across what's changing in that external environment and identified 5 drivers that could have a major impact on how the future turns out, specifically the future of math. And if you're looking at the publication that Catherine put in the chat, You can find those drivers on page 4, but just to name them quickly: accelerating technologies, inescapable climate crisis, diversifying education, contested society, and rebalancing economics. And so we took those drivers, those forces of change that are shaping the future, and combined them in different ways to create 4 scenarios, which are stories about possible futures. And in those scenarios, we kind of did a broad story of what this future might be like, and then explored some personal experiences of young people or educators in that future world, and then investigated what math education in that future might look like. And then the final piece of the publication is looking across all the scenarios and lifting up what are the big issues that people who are interested in improving math education should be thinking about, given the possibilities raised in the publication. So this is really a broad look at possible futures, ways that things could turn out, so that we can then begin to think about the ways we want things to turn out. And as far as the process, really we engaged in a futures research process, and then engaged a lot of people outside of our team. So that involved lived experts, which that encompasses young people, students, math educators, parents. We did workshops with them at the very beginning to say, hey, these are the changes that we're looking at. Do these feel relevant to you? Do these things seem like the things that will affect people's lives in the future? And we asked them to generate ideas about the future. They created artifacts from the future, thinking about things that could exist, processes, objects, learning experiences that might exist in the future, to get their input at the ground level of this process. And then we carried that through. We did other workshops with some amazing subject matter experts, some of whom I'm so glad to see in the audience today, with a really deep understanding of math and math education, specifically for Black, Latino students and students from low-income backgrounds. And they carried that thread through, and the entire process said, here's what we heard from parents, here's what we heard from young people. Let's make sure that that continues to come to the forefront of this research. And so it was a really exciting and collaborative process, and we're really, really glad. And I found the process really thought-provoking, and some really interesting ideas about math education came through. And the collaboration with all of those lived and subject matter experts was really central to that process for us.
Thanks, Katie. And Estelle, similarly, can you describe what's covered in Modernizing Math, Envisioning Liberatory Math Futures, and a bit about your process of how you got to these insights?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I see a lot of familiar names. Thank you for being here. My name is SL. I'm calling from the lands of the Coastal Salish peoples in Western Washington. Yeah, thank you for that question, Amanda. So I think we were asked to consider the future of how and what math will be taught 20 to 30 years out. And so to do this work, I'll talk about the process first and kind of then jump into what's in the document. So to be able to do that, we really wanted to first understand, by looking into the past, what has already been done systematically, policy-wise, societally, and culturally to create an education system that is not supporting Black, Latino students, and students of all races and ethnicities who are experiencing poverty. And also sometimes, it's creating a system that's harmful for these students. And then second, we wanted to work and learn with those who are closest to the problem and furthest from the opportunity. And in this case, it is Black, Latino, and students experiencing poverty from all races and ethnicities. And we wanted to include their caregivers and educators who are in those classrooms to better understand what is the context and what are they experiencing as well. And by engaging directly with those who are closest to the problem, we're able to go beyond, people who are closest to the problem are experts in that experience, and a lot of times their expertise is not valued. And so one of the things that we wanted to do is create a space where lived experts, as Katie pointed out, have the opportunity to dream and build from their experiences to think about what the future of math can actually be. So we wanted to create spaces that are healing-centered and also creative and imaginative. And so we immersed people in experiences where they could think and dream about what the future of math actually looks like from a lot of different dimensions. And And as equity-centered designers, we focus on creative collaboration and co-creation as part of the experience of designing, products, services, and strategies. And so we engaged in that similar process here. And so the document is actually a compilation of these expectations and visions for math education directly from lived experts. On the back end, we engaged with a lot of subject matter experts across policy, technology, different school districts, as a way to understand how do we make these visions that lived experts have a reality. So what are the steps that need to be taken by different stakeholders to be able to actually make these visions reality? So the document is a compilation not just of a vision and a dream, but also goes deeply into what are some of the things that need to happen for these math futures to exist, and what are the direct action steps that different stakeholders can take.
Thank you both for sharing. I think that gives us a really good groundwork of what's included in both of these documents. And so it seems like both of them have pretty distinct contents. If you can describe, Katie, for us, how do they complement each other and how can they be used effectively, potentially as combined resources?
Yes, absolutely. So it was really wonderful being able to collaborate on these documents. They were really developed sort of in tandem. But in strategic foresight, which is the discipline and the methodology that we use to explore possible futures, we really believe that first we should look out to the broad possible future. Consider a wide range of possibilities, ask new questions, consider new ideas, some of which we may not like very much, possibilities that may feel uncomfortable to us, but that doing that allows us to have that wider lens on possibilities, on change. And then from there, we can zoom in on, given this range of possibilities, what do we really want to happen? And then how might we get there? Because if we start just with what we want to happen, we're likely to get surprised and to maybe be thrown off course by a set of possibilities we had never anticipated. And while we can never manage all of the uncertainty that the future inherently holds, we really believe that looking at that broad range of possible futures sets us up to create a really resilient and future-proof vision. And so Futures Affecting Math Education, the KnowledgeWorks piece, really takes that big picture view of the possible futures and what math might look like in a range of contexts. And then Optimistic Design's piece, Envisioning Liberatory Math Futures, really zooms in a little bit more on a vision for math and some clear action steps to get there.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm curious, SL, with this kind of idea of this future casting document and these visions in which KnowledgeWorks have outlined in their document, how have the futures that they've developed informed the Modernizing Math publication? And additionally, what actions can people take to achieve the visions in which are articulated in your publication?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, to be honest, a lot of the foundation for where we started our co-creation with lived experts came from the work that KnowledgeWorks did. So the areas that they identified as possible futures were the ones that we used to immerse lived experts in, because we didn't want people to be limited by what's happening today. We all have a present bias, and we are really drawn into what is happening today at this moment. And it kind of makes it harder to look out in the future. So being able to create immersive experiences where lived experts are really, really deeply immersed in those realities that KnowledgeWorks really beautifully highlighted was a way for us to, have lived experts dream up ideas for those futures rather than be focused on what's happening today, because that is going to limit us. And it's going to make it harder for us to actually be able to think about and actually move towards the futures and be prepared for the futures that might happen and, that might come out in 20 to 30 years. And so we recognize students might experience a very different world from what we're experiencing today, from, some of the things that KnowledgeWorks' document has already highlighted was the climate crisis, changes to the workforce. So we wanted to use that as a starting point for lived experts. And so you'll see in the document, we do come back to it and we highlight some of the ideas from there. The second part of your question was around kind of what are the actions that people can take to achieve the visions articulated in the publication. So there are actually 4 different distinct areas where folks can start off taking action. So one of the areas is thinking about the baseline conditions. So these are conditions that need to be achieved for a liberatory future. These, because of historic and current systemic racism, there are baseline changes that need to be considered for us to be able to build towards a future, towards a better future. And, for example, one of those things is really meeting, this came up in our conversations with caregivers, teachers, and students, but also just in all of the research that we did. We really need to be addressing and thinking about, some basic things like, do students have access to housing? Do caregivers and families have access to healthcare, access to job opportunities? Those are things that sometimes when we're thinking about easy ideas to move forward, we don't actually think about those systemic things that need to be addressed. Additionally, there's another area that we identified, which is shifting current mindsets that might be impacting our ability to engage towards a liberatory math education. We've included these mindsets and also, what are the shifts that are needed? And so this can apply across the board from district leaders to policymakers to everyone who's engaging in kind of thinking about the future and trying to shift the current education system. So you'll find that in the document as well. We've also identified the third area is for technologists. We've identified areas where principles for emerging technology, and these are clear actions that technologists, founders, product companies working in education technology can look at and think about what are the implications of the technology that you're developing, and what are ways in which you can ensure that it's not going to cause harm in the future, in the ways in which it's implemented, the ways in which you're thinking about it, the problems that you're trying to solve. And so there are some principles we've identified. We've also identified opportunities. So those, again, clear action steps. And finally, the most obvious area for taking action is we have areas that we call the levers. So these are areas that are identified and clearly connect back to the ideal visions that lived experts have. And so these are 4 levers, and each lever has multiple action steps. And as a stakeholder in the system, as a founder, as a policymaker, as a district administrator, there are separate actions that folks can take and jump into today, actually. So, yeah. So a lot of areas for action taking.
Awesome. I actually would love to continue to have you explain and provide a little bit more. It sounds like there's a lot of research that had gone in to getting to these insights, to creating some actionable ways in which folks can use this document today. What are some of the key research insights that you feel have been contributing to informing this more equitable future and successful math outcome for those priority students that you mentioned, those Black, Latino, and low income students?
Yeah. Thank you for that question, because I think it'll sound like I'm repeating myself, but really, I think from our research, we really understood that to be able to look towards a future where Black, Latino, and students of all races experiencing poverty and their families and communities are thriving, not just surviving, we really need to think more holistically about their experiences and things that might be impacting them. Part of it is the classroom, the curriculum, the content, the education system, but also what are the experiences that are outside of the classroom that also sometimes come into the classroom. And this is when you're thinking about equity in future of math education, we really have to consider those baseline conditions that I mentioned in my previous answer. Without being able to address some of the root causes, we're just going to be creating band-aid solutions, and we will reinforce existing harms. So sometimes when we think about shifts, changes, we really need to be thinking systematically. So to be able to ensure that we have equitable futures, we need to really consider, what are some of the root causes? And so we address that in this document. And hopefully, gives a pathway for stakeholders who have the power to make those shifts or think about that more deeply to consider some of the recommendations that we've made. Additionally, I think it's a piece around, it's not just enough to continue to do the things that we're doing over and over again. We need to step back and really think about how our mindsets and current processes might be reinforcing existing loops of harm, right? And so what does that actually mean? So we kind of talk about one of the things is like challenging existing mindsets that, Black, Latino, and students of students who are experiencing poverty are, lack mathematical skills or aptitude, or culturally are not meant to do math, right? And this is a very, very harmful, this is one of many, mindsets and assumptions that might exist. And it might show up in different ways, even if someone doesn't, actively state it, is it shows up in the ways the system is built, the ways in which like educators and caregivers interact with students, and it impacts students, caregivers, and the narratives, but it also impacts like employers and others who are thinking about how to engage with students as they move out of the schooling system, right? So really thinking about what are these mindsets that we need to shift? How do we adopt new mindsets to think about how to create a space where we're looking at students' assets and bringing a systems lens and being more student-centered? And I know some of these words like being student-centered has been part of the education system, but also being student-centered is thinking about how to think about sharing power in the classroom, but also in implementing new ideas and solutions. How do you think about students as a key part and a stakeholder in that process? How are we gathering information from them about what is successful and what is not, and how is that impacting how we change our processes, how we think about implementation? And these are really, really drastic changes, because a lot of times, because of adultism in our society and systems, we don't think about students as having skills or the aptitude to be those active participants with us as we think about designing new solutions and services in the education space, and then also implementing them. A lot of times, students just, and a lot of teachers too, just experience the other side of a policy implementation without necessarily having any say in it. So can we actually shift that? And what does that actually mean? Because I think these are the more structural changes that are going to help us get towards those liberatory futures. And yeah, these shifts need to happen across funders, policymakers, at the district level, and all of the different places where we're actually thinking about co-creating these changes, co-implementing, and setting up for processes that in the future we can continue to move towards equity.
Fantastic. I'm really intrigued, and also there's a lot of the idea of taking an asset-based approach across all the myriad of different audiences who would be using this document in practice. Katie, I'd love to throw this question also back to you as well. If you can share some key research insights that contributed to your increasing and equitable future.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. The notion that shows up in our publication that I think has just really stuck with me the most is this idea of math as a source of healing and of support. So this is an idea that I think first emerged from our subject matter expert workshop, and we had the great fortune to partner and co-design with the Afro-Rhythm Futures group, and they have an amazing futures-oriented game called Afro-Rhythms from the Future, where people create artifacts from the future, and it's grounded in Afrofuturist methodology. And one thing that we consistently heard in our workshops with young people, with parents, with subject matter experts, was just the harm that many of them have experienced through math education. And these are, in our subject matter expert, these are people who have gone on to do math, and they still just carry a lot of pain around the experiences they had. Some of the mindsets, the harmful mindsets that SL mentioned, being examples, and just some of the practices in math, and some of the beliefs about students, and parents saying, whenever I try to help my student with math, I just feel it's so difficult emotionally because they're remembering those experiences and what they may have been told about themselves, and their abilities in math, and the experiences. And so to take that as kind of a current state, and to imagine a future where math is not only just not harmful, but actively serving as a source of healing and support, was just such an incredible concept for me that people brought up in our workshops, and that showed up in some of our scenarios. Just really that math can be a way for young people to connect with their own identity, to connect with their communities, that educators, one of the scenarios describes educators creating opportunities to, or creating culturally relevant environments that really enable young people to build those connections. And in those ideas, math is this critical element, but it's not the only focus of those learning environments. Math is woven in with these ideas of cultural relevance and responsiveness, and culturally sustaining practices. And there are so many educators who are doing that, working on that. And how do we make that just the norm? How do we make that the way that the system is designed, that math is this way that young people, that educators see as this opportunity for connection and for belonging, as opposed to how so many people experience it today, which is this othering and marginalizing discipline, where if you're in, you're in, and if you're out, you're out, and that's just the way it is. And how do we just change the narrative and the beliefs and the mindsets around that? And I'm just really grateful to all of the people who participated in our research process, who lifted up that possibility, and who really truly believe that we can get there, and are doing the work right now. And it's a matter of, how do we make that systemic? How do we make that the norm and the way that people experience math?
Thank you. I think I've been hearing a lot of similar research themes and insights that came out of both of your processes. Katie, I'd love for you to kind of share a little bit more about what common themes did you observe when looking at the Modernizing Math publication from Optimistic Design?
Yeah, it was really exciting to see kind of both publications side by side, and see some of those similar ideas coming out. A couple that really stood out to me is something that SL mentioned, is really this environment around math education is so critical. So those kind of basic needs that SL mentioned, but also things like teacher training, collaboration, funding, though those are basic things, and we hear about them all the time, they really are directly linked to how far we can go in modernizing and improving math education without attending to the environments around math education, meaning both just the life experiences and what opportunities families and young people have, and also the environments in schools. That is really going to set the stage for how far we can push beyond the current state of math education. And that was really a theme that I saw in both publications. And others around technology, and specifically mindsets around technology. So technology is so enmeshed in the conversation around math education, both as technology as a potential tool to help modernize math education, which it certainly can be, and also emerging and accelerating technologies as a rationale for modernizing math education. We're going to be living in this increasingly technology-driven world. Math is obviously an important part of the development and the use of technology. And so we can say, because we are going to be living in this kind of future, math is really critically important. All of those things are true. And most technologies that exist right now and have existed have been created for the purpose of creating profit. And so we really need to understand what tools we're using. If we're saying technology can be a lever and a way to increase equity, can be a way to get to a more liberatory future of math education, we have to be really careful about the ways in which we use technology and our mindsets about technology, and who is involved in developing the technologies that are used to try to increase that equity. Because we can't just take technologies that have been developed for other purposes and layer them on and say, and now will modernize math in ways that that support these students who have been historically marginalized. We really have to take a different mindset and approach to technology and say, how can we use it in a way and develop it in a way where it's explicitly for that purpose? So I really appreciated the parallels in both of the publications around those kind of environments surrounding math education, and really the thoughtful ways that technology needs to be used and deployed to try and reach the goals that we'd like to reach.
I think that's a great segue to have SLU elaborate a little bit more on the tech principles that you mentioned earlier. Can you provide a little bit more about what that means and what should folks be thinking about when it comes to equitable technologies and impacting the future of math education?
Yeah, for sure. We actually have a whole section where we think about different opportunities that emerging technology can play, because a lot of when students and caregivers and teachers were imagining these experiences within, within this future world, something that Katie brought up in the previous question was around like, what came up around cultural relevancy. And so some things that they brought up was around how technology can stay in the back, but really enable that like deep relevancy and allow for interdisciplinary learning for students. So we actually dove a little bit deeper and said, okay, so we know that the technology is accelerating. There's a lot of good that can happen, but we also now know, there's a lot of research that shows how technology a lot of times gets implemented in the classroom for students who are experiencing poverty, for students who are Black and Latino. A lot of times for the same technology will be implemented in classrooms in other schools that are predominantly white for creative purposes, and will be implemented in classrooms for students experiencing poverty as more as a punitive, repetitive process, right? And so we thought about, okay, what are potential implications and applications for technology across the board, from like how teachers may use it, not only in the classroom, but for their own professional development. And so we have a section that also includes risks. But that said, with that in mind, that's where our technology principles kind of come from, is this deeper understanding of how technology has been implemented and what lived experts are dreaming and hoping for. And so with that, we were really thinking about, okay, so some of the principles that we have is to be able to continue to, we can't set technology and expect it to just work, because the social cultural context is continuously changing. And so one of the ways to mitigate the impact of that change and technology not keeping up is really co-creating with students, with teachers in classrooms, especially students who have the least access to power. So if you are in the process of saying like, yes, we do co-create, but we are only focusing on certain states and certain types of students, then you really need to step back and consider, like, who are you co-creating with? Like, who should be included in that process? And then co-creation as a technologist is different from testing your product. That is not testing your product with students and teachers is not co-creating. So really, if you had to do co-creation, you're really stepping back and thinking deeply about, where's the power held? How much power do the researchers on your team, the technologists, the founders of your team hold in making the decisions on like what you consider as important as you're taking away from those conversations with students, with teachers? And then, what decisions do you make? How do you make those decisions? All of those kind of questions come up, right? And so there is a lot of work being articulated in co-creation, but we talk about, deep co-creation that is not just going and doing extractive research. It's not just interviewing and coming back and saying you did co-creation. It's not just testing and saying co-creation. It is really sitting there and understanding what kind of technology would you like to see for the issues that you're seeing around you, and can we build it from there? And so, and also being really transparent about what can this technology do, what can it not? And then, so that is one of the principles. It's also a process and a mindset, because a lot of co-creation requires this underlying change in how we think about and approach technology development. We also talk a little bit about, what I just mentioned and how technology is implemented is sometimes even technology that is meant to be creative is implemented in ways that are punitive and restrictive for students. And so can we think and dream of ways in which, as technologists, we can develop technology that is continue to support students in being creative? It's pushing beyond what is there today, rather than just saying, oh, math is about practice. We just need to continue to do practice, and it's only going to point out your mistakes. Because a lot of times that's where those disconnects happen, is math is not just about practicing. I know there is a level of like, yes, practice is important, but also showing students the connections with their environment, with things that are important to them, and the relevancy. And I think that's coming back to my first point, is that's something that students brought up. And so the creativity of like how technology can be implemented for students to use more creatively, I think is really important. We also talk a little bit about human relationships, the focus on human relationships. So technology a lot of times ends up being implemented in a way that is isolating and instead of focusing on enabling or empowering the stakeholders or users, it ends up becoming the dominant force. So technology really needs to kind of step back and be an enabling factor, rather than the expected silver bullet to solve every problem. So when we start thinking about focusing on human relationship, is like, how can technology, instead of being the thing that's going to improve the student, is really enabling that better interaction between the student and the educator, so that relationship is what helps and supports students and nurtures students. Maybe there's opportunities where technology can support students, support educators in engaging with students better. So it's still creating those opportunities, right? So that's what we kind of highlight in our in the principles. So that's just like 3 of them, but we also have a few more, which is, we talked a little bit about creativity, but active learning. How can it, instead of just being practice and rote memorization, is really creating opportunities for students and teachers to engage in different ways. So supporting teachers to create spaces that are more active, especially for math, which is a little bit harder, or people think is harder or can't be done. And then also there's a little space around like data autonomy. It came up a lot with students. It also came up with caregivers and teachers. As we think about the future, there's a lot of implications for how data might impact students, not just when they're engaging with technology, but over time, because we're collecting a lot of data, and that data can be connected to a lot of other things. So how can classrooms, communities, school districts, and students have some say in the data autonomy? So we think we share a little bit around the principles around like, what are you collecting? How can that be harmful? How do you think about data autonomy, which is very different, because a lot of times when you're a private company, you own the data and you take it, and you have a consent form at some point. It's full of dense language, and it's really hard to understand like what's actually happening to your data. So how do we think more holistically about data autonomy? So those are some of the things we go deeper into, and I'll stop there.
Awesome, thank you. I actually would like to hear from all of you that have joined us today. We've shared quite a bit about what are in both of these documents, and are curious to know what is resonating with you, or what stands out based on what both Katie and SL have shared with you today. Please use the chat. And I will give us a minute or so to have us, see what comes up for you. Also, as a reminder, the Q&A is still open. We will flip to that next. If you do have a question that you would like our panelists to address, please go ahead and add it to the Q&A. I have a few questions that have been coming through. I am going to throw it out to either you, SL, or Katie to pick up to respond. One that has come through in our chat: I would like to help my school system change to a better teaching system. How would they go about doing that? Pretty tall order, but wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think yes, it sort of depends on what your goals are. But if we're looking at some of what we've been talking about today, a more student-centered system, a system where agency for learners, for educators is really at the center, I think the first place to start is to begin to look at who is making decisions in your system and whose voices are included there, and to find out what the people whose voices, namely that's generally students, what is it that they want from the system? What would a better approach to teaching for them look like? And use that as a starting point. And then through those conversations and some authentic collaboration, as SL said, I think the same applies to educators as it does to product developers, that just saying, hey, did you like this? Testing it on someone, asking them a question once, and then going off and doing something isn't the same as co-design and co-creation. So really committing to involving educators, parents, students in any kind of redesign process or decision-making process would go an enormously long way towards improving the system. And I think from there, you kind of learn what is the direction that we might want to go together. So that would be my my advice on where to start.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. Yeah, it is definitely a very meaty question. We can dive really, really deep into it. And one of the things that's coming up for me is we have a little section in the lever in our document called Math Educator Transformation. And we talk a little bit about the mindset shifts that need to happen, and then also processes. So you can keep implementing new processes, but if we're not really addressing the mindset that enables us to think more deeply about those processes and how we will engage with them, I think that's going to be an issue. So there is some level of professional development that's needed. That's not just about let's say, like, hey, are these are the existing practices, are we just implementing them? But it's really thinking about, like, what are the current high leverage teaching practices? Is your classroom, are your educators implementing that? Are they supported? Are they incentivized? Because there's a lot of things that teachers are working on, and if we're asking them to do more, that's just more work, and they're having to do that without additional incentives, right? Like, the days are really full, classrooms are really busy. So really thinking about, okay, are you currently already engaging and implementing high leverage teaching practices? Is there professional development? Is there opportunity to engage? But also, yeah, as you think about the future of math, like how are we supporting educator, mindset transformation towards being more asset-based? The other thing is, like, thinking about student feedback, like, Katie kind of mentioned, like, that collaborative process with students. Who's making those decisions? Like, is there an opportunity to get feedback from students? And is there a way that educators can learn to review feedback, accept feedback? And that is its own, I think, professional development process, because that becomes a space for students to also be key collaborators in this work, but then also for, as educators, to be able to understand, what are you missing? What are the ways in which you might be communicating that might be impacting students? What else should you include? And these are just some of the many things that experts in this field have been talking about as they think about transformation at this current moment. But these are some of the things that came up as we were talking to students and caregivers about what are the opportunities that exist.
Awesome, thank you. We do have a few more questions that I think we have time for about one or two. Let's see what we can get through. We have a couple that have come through our chat here, and let's start with a question around, since math education has to be reimagined to be more in line with the future of work, what have employers done to be aligned to support education? And then similarly, I actually think this is sort of aligned, the second question here is, what sort of focuses on making more room for meaningful student and caregiver input, and if there's a policy recommendation around that as well. So it's almost it's kind of aligned, but similar. I'm curious to know your thoughts on either of those kind of questions. Whomever would like to hop in.
Yeah, I can start on that. And there was another question in the Q&A also. It's kind of about the sort of the chicken and the egg question around policy and kind of piloting and experimenting ideas. And so I think maybe I can try to hit on all three of these at the same time. That at KnowledgeWorks, we really believe that those things need to be addressed in a similar path. We think about it as kind of two train tracks: the bigger policy change questions, and then the learning and the capacity building and the trying new things at the classroom, student, district level. And that those really need to inform each other, because I think we've all seen policy that's made in a vacuum that is not informed by actually the experiences of students and educators. And we've seen where that can go wrong, because there's so much that we can't anticipate with a new policy. So can we be practicing things, be trying things, whether that's working with employers, whether that is incorporating student voice in small ways within whatever our sphere of influence is, and then using that to inform policy. So there absolutely are policy implications here. No educator or school or district can do any of the things we're talking about on their own, and they should not be expected to do that. That's just simply not possible. And we do need those experiences to inform the broader conversation. So we really believe that those process, and it's a delicate dance of kind of what comes first and what comes next. If we can be thinking there are policy moves to make, there are experiences that we're having that are going to help us learn, then we can begin to advocate with a more informed understanding of what that policy might need to look like. So whether we're talking about incorporating student voice, whether we're talking about aligning with employers or the sequencing, we think they need to be happening in close collaboration, and both really need to be in development at the same time, which is, like I said, a delicate thing. But we don't think about it as kind of what has to come first and then next, but how do we allow them to happen somewhat on a parallel track so that they can inform one another.
I don't think I have anything to add to that.
And we'll get to one last question. Does your work influence the Common Core standards and the brass ring of calculus in high school?
I will say that we do talk a little bit about it because it came up a lot with caregivers, students, and teachers. And so I think it's one of those pieces where we have addressed it, but the recommendations also go kind of think beyond that as well. So that's just something, as you're looking through, you will see a lot of the recommendations are around like how to think about relevancy around math as you think about calculus and also statistics and all of these things. But we focus more on a more open-ended question of like, what does it mean when you're thinking about it in a more interdisciplinary fashion? And so so that's kind of the perspective that we've taken as this work was looking into the future. But of course, as we mentioned, we had to look at the past and see what is working with Common Core, what is not working. And it's a complex answer, right? A lot of times it is the implementation pieces. So I think I'm not addressing your question completely, but we looked at Common Core and we kind of thought about what are the opportunities there? And I wouldn't say there was anything that came up from the lived experts conversation where it was like, this is the path to take, but really what came up that was more imaginative, more broad and aligned more directly with what we could expect with the unknowns of the future is that piece of like, really focusing on cultural relevancy, really focusing on like cultural contextual relevancy and what that actually means in that student's context and for their interests and what that might mean for what math is taught. So.
And I would just add that I think this question relates to the conversation that we were saying about the environment surrounding math. So obviously, what came up with a lot of our educators is the focus on content, the number of standards that we have to cover, and how just the rigidity of the system and the way that we teach math right now is a real barrier, and that is absolutely something that we heard and understand. And that's a real barrier, and that is not, as I said, something that any one educator can shift on their own. And so I do think that there are these bigger picture systemic pieces that need to be considered. And so I do think that it influences sort of what is the scope and sequence of math in the future. That is a big question that we should be asking. And I think we should be questioning the assumptions that are currently built in to the way that we structure math education. And so while that is a tall order, that's something that we can begin experimenting with in small ways and saying, can we shift our understanding or our mindsets around how we might approach some of these standards to begin as a starting point, and how we focus on this content, but in a way that is really meant to support students' sense of self and their ability to connect with this content. So can we start there as a way to inform what might the approach to math in the future look like? So there are obviously just a lot of systemic elements that need to be picked up here, and there are small ways that we can all begin questioning our assumptions and questioning the practices, even within the system that we currently have.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. There's so many comments that I want to heart in the chat, including folks talking about how math, felt more relevant when it was connected to interest, and how higher education needs to be part of this conversation. We had questions around workforce. So these are all the connections that came up, and we've really tried to work through these and recognize like this is a starting first step. And as Katie mentioned, there's a lot of opportunity for us to all work together to think about what comes next. My colleague Amanda might have had an internet issue and has unfortunately dropped off. So we are coming close to time. So I want to take a moment to thank you all for being here and being part of this conversation. Thank you for all the thought-provoking questions and your participation in the chat. I apologize we couldn't get to all the questions that there were, but we tried our best to get through them. We have the links to the documents in the chat, so if you need to access them, that's a great place to start and continue to engage and see what's what your next steps are. So thank you again for joining us. We hope that sharing our work has inspired you to take action and invites conversation towards the next steps of building a math future where all students can thrive. A link to today's recording for today's webinar will be available, and so it will be sent via a follow-up email to everyone who was able to attend. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a good rest of your day.